Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
India chose the losing side, Soviet Union. There is a real danger, let me put it bluntly, that in this new contest between US and China, India may end up choosing the losing side.
So why has Xi Jinping doubled down on authoritarianism and autocratic rule and so on? Surely there's something he's worried about internally.
I'm with Professor Kanti Bajpai, the Wilmer Professor of Asian Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, and Professor Kishore Mahbubani, a former civil servant in Singapore, diplomat and academic. He's now Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore, and the author of the book, Has China Won? You can see it very prominently on his bookshelf. But we are gathered today virtually online, both you gentlemen are in Singapore, I'm in Delhi, to talk about Professor Kanti Bajpai's book. So it's an inverted, I know you can see, oh, you have it there. Kanti, I hope you have a copy of the book.
Yes, of course I do. I was a little more modest about it.
No, not at all. I think we should all show it off. Published by Juggernaut Books, so all the viewers of The Print, please go out there and buy a copy of the book. But the reason it's so interesting is that not just because it's very easily, it's very readable for people like us, not just for professors like Kanti Bajpai and Professor Mahbubani, but regular people like us to understand why the India-China relationship is so contested. And actually, there's a strap in the book which says why they are not friends. It's right here. So, Professor Bajpai, if I could ask you the first question, and this is a question: why are India-China not friends? I mean, we keep talking about age-old ties, civilizational, historical, political, but why can't we be friends?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jyoti, for having me and, of course, Professor Mahbubani as well, who was my former dean. It's very kind of him to engage in this discussion as well. The book says there are really 4 reasons. I just want to say that you could probably say that any one of those reasons would explain why they are not friends, but it's a bit hard to sort out exactly which one is dominant, although I have some intuitions. But essentially, the book says, look at these 4 Ps. Mutual perceptions, the territorial perimeters, which are in dispute, including Tibet. Thirdly, strategic partnerships, that is, which of the great powers, primarily the United States or the Soviet Union and now Russia, have they partnered, and where do they come out, or which side do they come out? And lastly, comprehensive national power, the 4th P being power. And on all 4, I try to show that there are reasons why they just don't see eye to eye. I mean, essentially, mutual perceptions, beginning in about the late 19th century, there seems to be a move from a historical sense of respect towards each other to an increasing sense of disdain, primarily at the elite level, but also to some extent at the popular level.
Right.
Territorial perimeters, I think the story is probably quite well known, but what's not so well known is that there were always periods of cooperation, an attempt to negotiate at the beginning of the Cold War, and then again after the Cold War, and towards the end of the Cold War as well. But in 2 cycles, they've tried to cooperate over the border and over Tibet, succeeded to some extent, but then it's kind of degraded into conflict. Third P is strategic partnerships, and here the succinct point is that both during the Cold War and after the Cold War, they've never really been on the same side.
So can I just ask you to hold your thought on the partnership question? And actually, I'm going to bring in, the current politics on the India-China relationship. And of course, there's nothing more current than the conflict in Ladakh. And you talk about that in your perimeters category when you look at, territorial and the sovereignty questions as well. So perhaps if you can just contextualize for us in terms of the current conflict in Ladakh, over a year old, the Galwan Valley incident in which 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives was just over a year ago. How would you look at that in the context of your study?
Well, the book doesn't address it in great detail because it's breaking news and we don't have all the background. But I think at the end of the day, I see it as part of the kind of quarrel over the territorial perimeters. I mean, there have been arguments that it's about Chinese unhappiness with Indian foreign policy in general, particularly cozying up to the United States. Another view is that it's really about India's internal politics and the Article 370 revocation. But I think it really probably at the end of the day is about the infrastructure development that's gone on, particularly in the Ladakh sector. And so if you look back at 2020 and roll the movie backwards, from 2013, there was the problem in Depsang, in 2014 in Chumar, in 2015 in Birdsey. These are all in the sector. They all related to various infrastructure developments that the Chinese didn't like, or sometimes the Indians didn't like very much. And Doklam, which is in another sector, was again about an infrastructure issue, the extension of a Chinese road. So I think there's something about the way in which India now is trying to catch up on infrastructure, which is making China unhappy. And so I would say, you know, if one had to plump for a reason, I would plump for the infrastructure extension reason, and that takes us back to the territorial perimeter quarrel.
Sure. Professor Mahbubani, if I can ask you the same question, which is the part headline of Professor Bajpai's book. Why are we not friends? Why are India and China not friends?
First of all, let me say that this book is brilliant. Okay? I want to emphasize that point. And I learned so much from it. And it's actually quite an amazing book, and it's amazing how timely it is.
Right.
But if I want to answer your question, why are they not friends? My view of life is that things happen as a result of choices. Certainly events drive history, events drive geopolitics, but you can also make choices. And for whatever reason, clearly the decision has been made in Delhi and Beijing to some extent too, not to become friends. And the thing that is very sad, and Kanti of course documents this very well, is the sort of steady erosion of trust that has happened between China and India. And unfortunately, the brakes have not been applied when the erosion took place. But to balance what I just said, when I use the word choice, I want to emphasize equally importantly that India and China can choose to be friends, can choose to work together. I mean, they are clearly not going to become bosom buddies, but they can learn to live with each other, live with the differences, and yet carry on a relatively positive relationship. In the way, by the way, just to emphasize a key point, China's differences with Japan are far deeper than with India, okay? Because Japan occupied China, okay? Killed lots of Chinese, but they choose to live together and work together. China and Vietnam have been fighting for 2,000 years. Vietnam has been occupied by 1,000 years. Vietnam and China have decided to live with each other. So you can choose. So at the end of the day, it's about choices also.
But if it's about choices, Professor Bajpai, and your point about partnerships, and you bring in all the sort of, it's like a bit of an opera with so many characters, whether it's Nehru, Zhou Enlai, Mao, and how Mao wants to teach a lesson, and wants to teach India a lesson in 1962. But if you look at this, the last 70 odd years since independence of both countries, and when the Red Army comes to power in China, this question of choosing to be partners or not choosing to be partners, how do you look at that?
Well, the book, talks about partnerships in respect of who we choose amongst the great powers. And so if that's what you mean, I think the choices are pretty clear. India has always chosen a strong partner, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, very briefly the United States in the '62 war, but after the Cold War, the United States to balance against China. China has chosen partners, but not against India. China has partnered the Soviet Union against the Americans, and then partnered the Americans against the Soviets. And today, Beijing is back, in a sense, in a partnership with the Russians against the Americans. And this reflects the fact that China is stronger than India. It doesn't need a balancing partner against India, but India does need a balancing partner. So I think one of the things that's quite difficult in this relationship is that the asymmetry of power pushes India towards balancing behavior. The Chinese don't like it because it's against them. The Chinese don't need to balance, but the Indian choice to balance, adds to the kind of mistrust that Kishore mentioned.
But Professor Mahbubani, you're talking about choices, and you're not ascribing blame, of course. But the question is, in the Ladakh conflict, it was the Chinese that intruded across the line of actual control into Indian territory. Now, you may argue that there are different perceptions of the line of actual control, but having said that, they have crossed a certain line. They are in places today where they were not in April 2020. So if China is this country which is 5 times larger than India economically, stronger military power, etc., why does it want to do that?
Well, to be honest with you, as you yourself said, there is this Indian view that it was the Chinese who started the intrusion. I don't have the facts, so it's very difficult for me to comment on what the facts are. But my understanding also is that it's very clear that neither China nor India wanted this confrontation. My sense is that it was an accident waiting to happen, partly because they were getting closer and meeting eyeball to eyeball more often because of technology carried the armed forces up higher. Infrastructure development brought them closer and closer. So it was an accident waiting to happen. But even after an accident happens, I don't know whether you've been involved in a car crash. I am a driver, and Kanti will tell you I drive very fast. I have had car crashes, and there are 2 things that can happen when you have a car crash. The 2 drivers can get out and talk to each other and say, hey, let's figure this out and how we find a solution. Or you can basically get out of the car and start punching each other. And I've experienced both, by the way. So in my sense, that's exactly what happened. There was a kind of a car crash, and it ended up in literally a punch-up. But at the same time, you can also choose what to do about it. I can tell you, by the way, I'll give you an example. The Chinese felt absolutely humiliated when the United States bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Now, of course, the Americans say, it was an accident. But it so happened that the bomb landed in the room where the Chinese intelligence officers were sitting with their signals equipment. Mm-hmm. Accident. The Chinese didn't believe it. But what did the Chinese do? They said, no, we cannot. This is not our time. Let's wait. Let's bide our time. That time will come when we will decide what to do, but let's be patient. Let's first accumulate strength and not cut off all our ties. And the Chinese basically have swallowed bitter humiliation several times. So that they say, okay, first build up our national strength, and then we'll decide where to come. So this goes back to my key point about choices. So do you choose now to fight over the Ladakh issue? You say, okay, no, not my time now. Don't worry, I'll remember this. I'll come back in 20 years. I'll come back in 30 years. But I'll wait till the moment is right for me. And this is why, Jyoti, as you know, I've always argued that the fundamental problem with India when it comes to geopolitics is that Indians react emotionally to geopolitical challenges when they should be cold, calculating, and cunning. And the party that is cold, calculating, and cunning is always in a better spot than the party that is emotional. When you can vent all your emotions, then ask yourself, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, are you going to be stronger or weaker in the equation? You've got to work towards a plan that makes you stronger in the equation. And I, as a friend of India, as you know, I want India to be stronger, not be weaker.
Right. Professor Bajpai, that's a provocative thought that India should bite its tongue, ignore the intrusion or provocation across the line of actual control, and build its own power and then come back 20 years later or whenever. But do you think that this is inevitable, this distrust between India and China, Asia's two largest powers?
Well, I mean, the whole book suggests that it does run very deep. And I think, put the question slightly differently, China has a record of solving territorial quarrels with many of its neighbors, most of them, in fact. The one that hasn't been solved is, of course, the one with India. And
Right.
it's a question mark. And I think one of the reasons for that is that, unfortunately for India and China, they have Tibet between them. None of the other quarrels have Tibet. Tibet is really very vital for the Chinese. Greater Tibet is about 40% of the territorial landmass of China. And I think sometimes we in India don't comprehend that point, that the importance of Tibet is unique to the India-China quarrel. It doesn't impinge on relations really with Pakistan or with Vietnam or Burma to any great extent, or Russia or Japan. But Tibet is a massive issue for the Chinese in terms of integrating Tibet, and it abuts the border with India. So I think one of the really big problems, and this points to a future concern, is that as the Dalai gets older, the present Dalai Lama, we're moving into a period which may have significant dangers ahead. China will have to think about the issue of the next Dalai Lama. The Tibetans will have to think about it too. India will have a challenge, and there could be a lot of misunderstandings and mistrust generated on top of everything else that we have to worry about. So I think that the issue of Tibet is really very important, and how the trust issue goes forward. And if you read John Garver's account based on Chinese archives, he presents the view that Tibet was the original reason for war. It wasn't really little bits and pieces of territory around Arunachal Pradesh or in Ladakh. Fundamentally, the Chinese thought that India, along with the Americans, was interfering in Tibet in the late 1950s.
Professor Mahbubani, would you agree? Because in India, we've somehow grown to thinking of the Dalai Lama as a spiritual man. And, he sort of delivers lectures on the philosophy of Nagarjuna, for example. He talks about himself as a son of India, who is bringing back some of these old texts. But as a political leader, I mean, I'm not sure that anybody in their right mind is going to think of the Dalai Lama as a political leader who has ambitions of going back to Tibet and recovering his throne. So for the Chinese to call him a splittist person seems a little bit out of whack.
Well, let me begin by saying that I have great respect and admiration for the Dalai Lama. One of the highlights in 2020 was that I actually participated in a Zoom conversation with him. Like hundreds of people know me. But I was there, and I have great respect and admiration for him. He's a delightful human being, and he's a wonderful human being, a man of great moral character, and there's no question whatsoever that's true about Dalai Lama. But it's also true, and this is also a key point that I think this is one of the most important points I learned from Kanti's book, was how important the issue of Tibet is to the Chinese. And the Dalai Lama, even though he himself, I think, knows for a fact that an independent Tibet is out of the question, and so, as you know, he's calling for greater autonomy for Tibet. And by the way, in theory, the Chinese also believe in greater autonomy for Tibet, so there's no fundamental difference over that issue. But nonetheless, the Dalai Lama is being used as a political weapon by some in the West who want to embarrass China. So he's being used as a tool.
Do you believe that? Because he's sitting in India. Sure, he travels across the world, but he's essentially a religious leader or a spiritual leader. He doesn't want to break up China. He said that more than once.
It's very important when you're negotiating with another party to step into the shoes of the other party and understand what their concerns and insecurities are. And I think Kanti is right in suggesting that the insecurities of China on Tibet are real and have to be dealt with. And the key, and this is the most important point I make on Tibet, by the way, Tibet has become, and Kanti described it again very well, a source of distrust and contention between India and China. But Tibet actually can become a point of agreement between China and India, because at the end of the day, India doesn't claim Tibet, okay? India doesn't try to in any way support, let's say, military forces trying to overthrow the Tibet, whatever. That's not happening at all. So India's hands are clean on Tibet in that sense. So that's why they can actually reach an agreement. And it's also important, diplomacy is always about sending the right signals. I'll give you a live example. The most dangerous situation in the world today is Taiwan, which also begins with T. And China is beginning to feel that the US is changing the lines on Taiwan. And the Chinese, therefore, have stepped up their military activities to say, watch out. If you're going to change the red lines, I'm going to start attacking you. So the Biden administration did something very smart. Very smart. It just quietly turned away from the Trump policy of upgrading official ties with Taiwan and sent very clear signals to Beijing. They're going back to unofficial ties with Taiwan. And you notice that kind of message of reassurance has lowered the temperature on Taiwan. So in the same way, I think a good private dialogue within China and India on Tibet, making it very clear that India is not in any way challenging China's claims over Tibet, and therefore use that as a platform, not of creating distrust, but actually of enhancing trust.
Right. Professor Bajpai, let's talk about India and China's perceptions of each other. I thought that was one of the most fascinating parts of your book, is that,
And depressing.
And depressing, absolutely. But, I mean, I haven't been to China for a while, but I remember on the Great Wall, you go there and they say, Hindu, Hindu. And it seemed all, sort of happy and positive. But from your book, it seems that if you sort of scratch the surface a little bit, and the Chinese believe that, sort of Indians are these sort of lazy, dark-skinned people, and you use this Chinese term, Ahsan. And of course, there are the India's perceptions of the Chinese in terms of, chinky and stuff. But can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the problem. This is why this chapter is right at the beginning of the book, because I think there's a tendency on both sides to try and evade this issue and paper it over, as you said, by a lot of nice talk on both sides. But in fact, there's kind of a strong substructure there at the elite level, at various kinds of popular levels as well, sort of casual racism on both sides. But you can see at the elite level, the book shows the kind of three very big worldviews in China. There's that Tianxia view, which sort of places China at the center of the universe, and other countries are kind of tributaries, not necessarily in a bad way, but they're lesser states who get access to China in return for sort of Chinese protection and beneficence. And so India there perhaps at best features as kind of one of the biggest tributaries in that worldview. In the communist period, the Chinese thought that they were the leaders of the global revolution against capitalism, not the Soviets, who opted for, kind of collaborating with the West increasingly. And in that, the great socialist revolution that would be led by China, well, perhaps a fellow socialist traveler like India could be a junior partner in that as well. And then there's the kind of great power perception in China, where, I don't think there's anyone in China who seriously identifies India today as a great power. An aspiring power, yes, perhaps a leading power in Jaishankar's terminology or Mr. Modi's terminology, but there's kind of a slight looking down the nose at India in terms of its power kind of aspirations as well. So that's one elite level. At another elite level, I think you made some mention of it, but looking at Indian democracy, for instance, and its political system, there's this term in Chinese, luan, which means chaotic. And I think that pretty much sums up quite a mainstream elite view of Indian democracy and its political system. It's chaotic. Nothing gets done, and so, yeah, there's this democracy, which isn't even, by the way, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, I think, once said about Indian democracy that it was a tribal democracy at best. So, I think there's even a looking down at the workings of modern Indian democracy. And then, you made mention of the sort of casual racism that's both on the Indian side, but also very much on the Chinese side. And so I think, certainly just looking at the Chinese side, the perceptions are not good. Back in the late 19th century, when Chinese reformers, intellectuals particularly, looked at India as a sort of drawing lessons for China in its confrontation with the West, it drew the lesson that the Indians had kind of, that they were not a very strong people. They were disunited, and they had fallen, to colonialism. And they were very contemptuous of India, sad at India's fall, but also contemptuous of the Indian people and Indian society. And so there's kind of a history, and I think that's a big challenge for India. And one of the things India has to think about is how to correct this perception of itself in Chinese eyes.
These perceptions, or this gap in this elite perception, do you think that's one of the reasons why the India-China relationship is so mistrustful?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you don't have great respect for each other, and I haven't talked about the lack of respect on the Indian side, if you don't have great respect for each other, it's quite difficult. I mean, it's a thoroughgoing sort of cultural artifact that works its way into the negotiating table when leaders meet, when elites talk to each other, when diplomats encounter each other, when the media talks about each other, which, these things matter to societies. And so I do emphasize it right at the start of the book. I know it's a depressing story, but I think we have to look at coal in the eye, just as we have to look at the other very big issue, which I think you're trying to avoid somewhat, which is the massive power gap between the two countries. When there's such a massive power gap, it is hard for two entities to look at each other in a kind of, very straightforward business-like way. And the broad point I make is that when the Chinese are so big, they don't see the need to accommodate India very much. And when India looks at China from a position of weakness, it fears being accommodative because it fears being seen as being weak and surrendering and appeasing. So that's Kishore talks, I think, rightly about choice. There's always choice. But this is a massive structural problem. Neither side wants it, but that's the fact of the matter, which is that there's an enormous gap in power, and that has psychological and political consequences. Professor
Mahbubani?
Yes, can I add a point? I agree with everything that Kanti has said, and I just want to compliment what he said. When the tone that the Chinese will adopt vis-a-vis their Indian counterparts will depend a lot on what the setting is, okay? And if they are talking in a setting where they're working towards a partnership, a cooperative partnership, China will emphasize, oh, India, you are my size, we are brothers, we are equal, and all that. And you saw this, by the way, in the meetings between Wen Jiabao and Manmohan Singh. And I thought they achieved a certain degree of rapport, from what I could tell.
Right.
And also, frankly, in the first two meetings between Xi Jinping and Modi, I think one in Wuhan, one in Chennai, I think.
Right.
Also, the tone was about us being equal brothers. So when it comes to cooperation, China is very happy to say, okay, we are my equal, we'll work together and all that. But if the perception in China is that India is working towards antagonism or in many ways, in one way or another, maybe siding with China's adversaries against China, then the message from Beijing will be very clear. It'll be exactly what Kanti has emphasized. Excuse me, you're 1/5 my size. Let's be clear about that. Let's be absolutely clear. You're not my equal when it comes to an adversarial relationship. So this also goes back to the question of the choice. See, so the question, I actually believe, and I want to emphasize this, there's opportunity for a grand strategic bargain between China and India, and they can come to a long-term understanding with both sides understanding where their core areas are of concern and both sides agreeing where you can make sure you don't cross each other's core areas of concern. But it requires basically both sides to take what I call a helicopter view of the relationship. And please don't dive into Galwan and Ladakh and say that must be solved. You take a larger view. And in that larger view, you can actually push aside major differences and even say, frankly, the Taiwan issue is a much hotter issue in the US-China relationship. But during the Cold War, they just froze it. You can choose to freeze issues.
But I think that's what, when you mentioned the meeting between Wen Jiabao and Manmohan Singh, so I think there was some attempt at accommodation. Professor Bajpai, what do you think? If the Chinese are going to continue to be dismissive about you, there is Hu Shijin, the editor of Global Times, this newspaper that we love to hate in India, but if you look at his Twitter timeline, there is a picture that he has taken from Weibo, from some Weibo chat, which is, it's about the Last Supper, except in this place of Jesus and his friends. There are animals in place of human beings, and India is represented by an elephant which is bleeding and on its knees, strapped to a medical drip which presumably has urine flowing through it. Now, if you look at images like this, what are you supposed to think?
Well, I mean, I think, of course, Global Times is deliberately provocative, and they represent a stream. So I think beyond the point, we shouldn't take it seriously. But I mean, it is part of the culture wars between the two countries. I mean, I'm sure if one looked at cartoons and, social media in India, we would see pretty awful things as well. So I wouldn't put too much store by the Global Times beyond the point. I mean, I'm not dismissive of Global Times. It does represent a view.
But if the Chinese are going to be dismissive about you, then how are you going to do an accommodation or a grand bargain that Professor?
Well, I mean, I think there's a history of accommodation. I mean, one of the things the book does show is that it's not all conflict. I mean, let's say from 1963 right up to until really the confrontations in 2013, 14, and 15, have relative military stability. Except for the problem that occurred in Nathula in 1967, very briefly. So that's an accomplishment. There's a whole bunch of confidence-building measures that they put together that did give them a degree of stability and trust. Trade flourished after 1988, and given Rajiv Gandhi's outreach then. So I mean, the book by no means, and I wouldn't say ever that India and China cannot accommodate. Kishore says they should be shrewd. I think India and China were both shrewd. They did freeze the quarrel for a very, very long time. And by the way, I mean, look at the record of negotiations from 1981 to right up to now, pretty much. Every single year they've negotiated over the boundary at different levels. That's an enormous record. But if you flip it around, the other side of that is that perceptions, the difference in power, kind of bitterness over the war, and some mistrust over who our partners are, still prevents, after 50 years almost of negotiation over the border, going back to 1981, 40 years, still haven't been able to crack the border problem. And I come back to Tibet. I think that this problem would have been solved if Tibet was simply not there, if we had shared a boundary that like many other neighbors do. But that's not the case. And I think it makes it very, very difficult. I mean, this cartoon is in bad taste, obviously, at a time of COVID, to show the Indian elephant on a drip with urine coming. But, that's that guy. He's crude and vulgar, frankly. But it represents a point of view, and it is a danger.
So, Professor Mahbubani, you're talking about this helicopter approach, but, in the book, in Kanti's book, he talks about the swap that never can be, this East-West swap, right? Where you have a status quo between the Western sector, which means that Aksai Chin, which India claims will remain with China because it's controlled by China, and similarly in the Eastern sector. But now the Chinese are saying that that's not true anymore, and that they will claim some parts of Arunachal Pradesh, something like that.
Well, if you know, in his book, Kanti also cites me once, and he cites a conversation I had with a very senior Chinese diplomat who actually participated in the China and India negotiations in the 1990s. And he said every time they met, the Indian delegation would say, our Chinese friends, Zhou and Lai proposed that we reach a grand bargain, settle on existing line control. Deng Xiaoping proposed we agree on a grand bargain, agree on the line of control. So why doesn't China propose it again, right? And the Chinese reply, which I think is a bit clever, was, why did you accept it at that time, right? So at the end of the day, let me be very clear and very blunt. The final agreement that will be reached within China and India will involve no major swap. It will be basically based on the existing line of control. So that's the tragedy, right? At the end of the day, the Chinese know they're not going to get Arunachal Pradesh, okay? They're not stupid. And India knows it's not going to get back Aksai Chin. I mean, India is not stupid either. At the end of the day, The agreement is staring at you at your face. What's missing is the political will or ability to deliver an agreement that will require both sides to redraw their maps. But I think, again, it can be done if it's part of a larger strategic bargain. And in that larger strategic bargain, I must emphasize this, it becomes very clear that both sides understand, I will not do things that will destabilize you in any way. And let me put it again, we haven't brought this up, okay? When India decides to join the Quad, okay, you can call the Quad anything you want. It's perceived by everybody, including China, as an anti-China alliance. That's why no ASEAN country wants to join it, okay? Let's be clear about that. So you want to send a signal, I'm going to join the anti-China club, and the Chinese said, okay, I get that signal. Okay, I have to respond. So this is how things escalate. So when you make decisions like that, you got to understand they're part of a big picture. That's why I say go up with a helicopter view. Be clear where you are. Let's both sides be clear. Where are you stepping on my toes and where am I stepping on your toes? Okay, let's get off our toes. It's a major operation. I think it can be done.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me just say one thing about that. I mean, I think it's a very attractive idea. And at some level, something like that has to happen. And both sides have always at various points recognized that in the end, it's not really just about this border issue. There has to be a larger kind of bargain. But there's an interesting Chinese point of view that's emerged and been stated recently by a China scholar in the United States at the Stimson Center, where she said there's a Chinese view on this, which is that, sure, we could come to some sort of an agreement on the border. What will India give us in return that is not revocable, that the Indians can't take away again? And of course, one of the candidates is Kishore's point that India sort of gives China an assurance that it won't be part of some sort of alliance against it. But what this lady asks is, yeah, that might be true on Monday, that the Indians agree that they won't join the alliance. But what's to stop the Indians on Tuesday or Wednesday signing back up for the alliance? So what is it that India can give the Chinese that is not revocable, you see? And I think that is a kind of a tricky matter for the diplomats on both sides as they think about a possible bargain. China is saying, we could give you irrevocably, more or less the kind of territorial status quo, like Kishore said. What are you going to give us in return, which is irrevocable? And I think that's a kind of an interesting question and not one that easily lends itself to an answer.
Kishore, what can India give China that China wants?
Well, I was a diplomat, as you know, for 33 years. And when I first began attending ASEAN meetings, Singapore had just separated from Malaysia in 1963. I attended meeting 71. The amount of distrust within Singapore and Malaysia was so enormous. As soon as Malaysia proposed something, we said, they must have something up their sleeve. They're doing it to embarrass us. And the same kind of suspicion Malaysia and Singapore had with Indonesia, because they just come out confrontation with Indonesia, right? I've lived through that distrust. And what's amazing is that the same ASEAN meetings I attended 20 years later, the distrust had evaporated. It was actually quite stunning, quite amazing. So I have lived through relations with countries which are highly distrustful and reach a position of trust. And it's a gradual process, but each time you do things where you acknowledge each other's interests and concerns. And by the way, I must say that both Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia and Malaysia have been very wise. We had territorial disputes, we sent them to the World Court. Whatever the World Court decided, we protested a bit here and there, but we accepted it, right? So there are ways and means of, my answer to you very simply is that there are ways and means of building up trust. And I thought, frankly, that the 2 rounds of meetings between Xi and Modi, where they spent so many hours with each other, I think that was starting an escalating process of trust, which was very good. Unfortunately, it's become disrupted. And at the same time, I think one big decision India has to make, by the way, this is a very painful decision, is, in the Cold War, basically, to be very blunt, India chose the losing side, the Soviet Union. There is a real danger, let me put it bluntly, that in this new contest within US and China, India may end up choose the losing side. So it's better for India to stand back and be a really independent, autonomous strategic actor. Because that will give India so much leverage. But how you behave as an independent, autonomous strategic actor is very different from the game that is being played.
No, but are you saying, just one second, in the current confrontation between the US and China, you're saying India seems to have picked the wrong side or the losing side again?
Well, I think it's the signals that India is sending very clearly that it is moving closer to the United States in many ways. It's partly the Quad, it's partly who you accept vaccines from, there are lots of signals. And by the way, if you want to ask a country that knows India very well, and that it's worked very closely with India, right, which is Russia, just ask your Russian friends, where do you think India stands today? So every action you take, this is part of the larger helicopter view,
Okay.
People around you are not stupid. They can see what you're doing and they react to it. And at the same time, if India chooses to be really autonomous and independent, India could enter a geopolitical sweet spot that is amazing. Tremendous opportunities for India today.
Okay, and I cannot let you go without you addressing Professor Mahbubani's point about India picking a losing side, as he says, in this current quarrel between the US and China.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I think the balance of power is, in the book, I play the other tune, which is that China still has a lot of ground to gain in many areas. Technology, it's got an aging population, it's got fiscal problems. And the one thing I'll just leave as a thought to both you and Kishore is, and this is where the book ends in a sense also, is that, why has Xi Jinping doubled down on authoritarianism and autocratic rule and so on? Surely there's something he's worried about internally. And so he cannot trust opening up the system. And I think that should give us pause about Chinese power. There are problems internally still, politically, economically, socially, and that means that there are vulnerabilities there. So I accept also that the United States has also got its domestic vulnerabilities, and we've seen them over the last 4 or 5 years. But it seems to me the balance may not be so clear-cut. It may not be so clear that China will be the winner in this next Cold War.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for this wonderful debate. Professor Kanti Bajpai, the author of this book, India versus China. So all of you do go out and buy it. And Professor Kishore Mahbubani, both of you at the National University of Singapore. Thank you so much for joining me at the Print Debates. Thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot.